The NFL is the most vicious sport in the world, so it's not surprising that a few criminals have played in the league. Let's look at 20 NFL players who went to jail. To start things off, we are going to tell you about Ray Kruth. The wide receiver was the Carolina Panthers' first-round pick in 1997, but made headlines for an absolutely horrible crime. In 2001, he was found guilty of conspiring to murder his pregnant girlfriend, Cherika Adams. I guess Kruth wasn't particularly excited about fatherhood. Adams was shot 4 times and managed to survive long enough for surgeons to deliver her 8-month fetus with an emergency cesarean section surgery. Cherika passed away shortly after delivery, but the baby did survive. Unfortunately, due to the shooting, Chancellor Lee Kruth was born with severe brain damage and cerebral palsy. Cherika Adams' mother, Sandra, raised Chancellor as her own and, in spite of his disabilities, recently graduated from high school. Meanwhile, Ray was recently released from prison, and we wish him nothing but the worst. There has got to be something horribly wrong with someone to do something like that. In the case of this next criminal, he was diagnosed with some pretty severe mental illness before getting arrested. Alonzo Spellman was a terrifying man. Not only was the former Bears defensive lineman 300 pounds, but he was completely crazy. After an incident where Spellman completely lost his marbles at a hospital because the doctor was late for his appointment, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Bipolar is a very common and treatable form of mental illness for those willing to make a change. Spellman wasn't one of those people, though. He refused to take medication and became even more volatile over time. In 2002, he had a manic episode while on an airplane where he became convinced that the flight was going to crash and he started freaking out. Apparently, he abused and threatened the flight crew so badly that they had to make an emergency landing. Spellman was arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison. I bet the flight attendants were reconsidering their career choices after that day at the office. Jeez. This next story proves that no matter what your occupation is, you can become an innocent victim to a crazy NFL criminal. Dante Stallworth was an NFL wide receiver who made his way around the league before committing an awful crime that ended a man's life. Mario Reyes was an innocent construction worker just trying to take the bus home from work, when Stallworth came swerving in, drunk out of his pie hole, and ran him over. Boom! Just like that, you can go from looking forward to dinner to never eating another dinner in your life. Stallworth was arrested for manslaughter because his blood alcohol content was way over the legal driving limit. But listen to this. Stallworth was only sentenced to 30 days in prison. What? That is not fair at all. I guess being an NFL star comes with some legal benefits. Well, at least this next player wasn't let off the hook so easily. Do you remember Kellen Winslow, the talented tight end for the Cleveland Browns? Well, turns out that he was a dangerous sexual predator. The former Pro Bowler was sentenced to 14 years in prison for multiple sex-related crimes. One thing particularly disgusting about Winslow was that he preyed on vulnerable women. One of his victims was a 50-year-old hitchhiker that he picked up and then raped in his car. In another incident, a teenage girl who he forced himself upon while she was passed out at a party. Makes us sick just telling the story. Winslow's lawyers claim that he committed these crimes because of the horrible head injuries he endured during his NFL career. The judge wasn't going to let him off the hook. CTE is a real thing though, and it horribly affects players' lives after retirement. Just ask the next player on our list. Aaron Hernandez became extremely famous when he allegedly killed a man named Otis Lloyd. Hernandez was in the middle of the prime years of his career with the New England Patriots when he was arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to life in prison. The case was so riveting that Netflix made a documentary to tell the whole story front to back. During the case, different plot lines regarding his relations with gang members and sexual orientation came into question. In 2017, while in jail, Hernandez hung himself in his cell using his bedsheets. Specialists studied his brain after the fact and found that he had horrific brain injuries that opened eyes to how detrimental an NFL career can be to the human brain. The Hernandez story is sad. It is deep, and there are so many dimensions to it that may make you feel bad for him, even though he is a killer. The next player we discuss doesn't have a long, complicated story tied to his arrest. He was just an idiot who probably should have ordered a taxi. Michael Floyd was a talented wideout for Arizona who got so drunk he fell asleep while driving his car. When police officers found him sleeping, they obviously gave him a breathalyzer to see if he was drunk. Drunk was an understatement in Floyd's case. In Arizona, they have different penalties based on how high the convict's blood alcohol content was at the time of the crime. Floyd's blood alcohol level exceeded the most severe reading recorded. He was more than double the legal driving limit and was given a super extreme DUI. He was sentenced to 124 days in prison. Alcohol is frequently abused, and some people might not fully comprehend how dangerous it can be. The running back coming in at number 14 was dealing with some harder stuff than just booze. Travis Henry was a gifted running back who ran for over 1,200 yards 3 separate times in his career. He is also a sad case of how drug addiction can ruin someone's life. Henry made a ton of money playing football. He signed a 5-year contract worth over $20 million. He seemed to be set for life. Unfortunately, his relationship with green and white ended up consuming him. He was so heavily addicted that he needed to find a new source of income to support his 9 children, with 9 different women. He started selling cocaine and got arrested on account of drug trafficking and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Henry wasn't the only running back involved in drug trafficking. Former Ravens star Jamal Lewis got caught as well. During his prime, Jamal Lewis was one of the most talented running backs the league has seen. He rushed for 295 yards in a single game, which set the all-time record. He also is one of the few running backs that ran for over 2,000 yards in a single season. So you have to wonder, why during the peak of his stardom would he get involved in selling cocaine? That question we don't have an answer to. All we know is that he came to an agreement with prosecutors that sentenced him to 4 months in prison. Lewis was a great running back in his heyday, but he isn't the all-time greatest running back to ever get arrested. He wasn't involved in one of the most famous trials in history either. Those titles both go to the next player on our list. O.J. Simpson was most famous for being prosecuted for the double murder of his ex-wife Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman. However, his lawyers did an incredible job of getting him acquitted. He was found not guilty, but still ended up in jail years later for a totally separate crime. In 2017, Buffalo Bill was convicted of armed robbery after breaking into a collectible dealer's showroom in Las Vegas, where he attempted to steal a bunch of sports memorabilia. He led 5 other armed men, but claimed that he was only trying to take back personal memorabilia that was taken from him during the 1995 trial. The court wasn't buying it. OJ wasn't let off the hook twice. He spent 9 years in prison before being released in 2017. Though there was a lot of evidence that made OJ seem like he was the murderer in his 1995 trial, the jury deemed that the evidence was not conclusive. In this next case, the player wasn't being left off the hook because the evidence was left in his pants. Plaxico Burress was another Pro Bowler that saw his stardom fall steeply when he committed a crime. The Giants wide receiver famously caught the Super Bowl winning touchdown in 2008. Only a little bit over a year later, he was convicted of a crime, a dumb one to boot. Plax entered a nightclub with a gun in the waistline of his pants, but it wasn't strapped in particularly well. The gun dropped into the leg of his pants and the trigger went off accidentally. Burress shot himself in the thigh and was taken into custody. Turns out the firearm wasn't registered and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. A lot of people close to Plaxico Burress felt bad for him at the time of the crime. Even the Giants organization claimed that he wasn't a bad guy, he just made a bad mistake. Well, the next player that we take a look at was just a bad guy who committed an even worse crime. Former Raiders first-round pick Anthony Smith went to prison for killing 3 men. Well, it may have been 4 men, but one of the murder cases was deemed a mistrial by the court. Either way, Smith was sentenced to life in prison for killing Kevin Nettles, Ricky Nettles, and Dennis Henderson. Not only did the defensive end commit triple murder, he also tortured all 3 men with duct tape and a hot iron before finishing the deed. Yikes. Some of these players are raised to be violent. Their mean streak led them to make millions in the NFL. At number 9, we have a former linebacker who found a lot of comfort in violence. Eric Naposki claims that the first time he tackled someone was when he was 8 years old, and it was the best feeling he ever felt. From that moment on, he knew he was going to be a football player. The linebacker played for the Patriots and met a soccer mom named Nanette Johnston, who caught his eye. He didn't realize she was in a relationship with a 52-year-old millionaire named Bill McLaughlin. Naposki began sleeping with Nanette Johnston, and when he realized that she was dating McLaughlin at the same time, it fueled Naposki's craving for violence. He allegedly shot McLaughlin to death out of anger, but wasn't put on trial until evidence showed up many years later that attached him to the case. When Naposki refused to share information about a particular gun that he owned that matched the murder weapon, it became clear to the jury that Naposki was guilty, so he was given a life sentence. Sometimes it takes years to prove someone guilty. Others commit crimes in sheer daylight, and it's not so hard to prosecute them. That's the case with Pro Bowl cornerback Brandon Browner. This guy broke into his ex-girlfriend's home and tried to suffocate her in front of her children in 2018. He pled no contest in court and was sentenced to 8 years in prison, attempted murder. That must have been terrifying for those kids. Fortunately, their mom survived the incident. Next up is a player that committed his crime in front of his entire neighborhood. Travis Rudolph was having a bad day. First, he allegedly got in a fight with his girlfriend, and then some guys got in a yelling match with him in front of his house. We don't know what the yelling match was about, but Rudolph was pissed. The former NFL wide receiver went into his house to get his gun and shot multiple people when he came back out. His lawyers claimed that he did so in an act of self-defense, but witnesses stated that no other men at the scene were armed besides Travis Rudolph. Sounds like that guy had a pretty bad day. But sometimes a bad day turns into a bad week, and then a bad month, and eventually you're just living a bad life. The next player on our list just couldn't be stopped no matter how many times he got punished. Lawrence Phillips was a talented running back, but boy did he have a mean streak. First, he choked his girlfriend unconscious. Then he hit 3 teenagers with his car after a pickup football game. He was found guilty on 7 charges, but didn't stop committing crimes. While serving his sentence, he attacked another ex-girlfriend and injured her badly before stealing her car. His prison sentence was extended from 10 years to 25 years. In prison, he allegedly choked his cellmate to death, and while on trial, committed suicide, putting an end to one mentally deranged life. His brain was donated for CTE research by his family. I wonder if the stardom goes to these guys' heads. Maybe having money and fame makes you think you can just get away with anything. This next player was expected to be a star quarterback, but his career never panned out. Ryan Leaf was a college star who will always be tied to Peyton Manning as the guy that the Colts almost picked instead. Manning became one of the all-time greatest football stars, and Ryan Leaf didn't last in the league. Clearly, he played football long enough to become dependent on painkillers to get through the day. Or maybe he was just addicted to pills like so many others. Leaf was arrested and charged with burglary and drug charges in 2008. Doctors alleged Leaf tried to get a painkiller called hydrocodone by presenting an incomplete medical history. When he couldn't get a doctor prescription, he then broke into a former football player's house where the drug was being stored. Leaf was sentenced to 5 years in prison. When a player's career doesn't turn out, you start feeling bad for them. That was not the case for this next player, though. Here's a story of one of the most exciting football players ever who operated a scandal that is beyond belief. Michael Vick was sensational as a dual-threat quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons. He could embarrass defenders with his ridiculous elusiveness. But he couldn't elude the American justice system when he was found guilty of operating an illegal dogfighting operation. Vick, along with a few other men, illegally conducted a league of competitive dogfighting on a 15-acre property in Virginia. The details of this operation are disturbing. Apparently, dogs that underperformed were put to death by means such as drowning, electrocution, and hanging. Vick was sentenced to almost 2 years in prison for his involvement. The next player on our list wasn't as elusive as Vick. When he committed his crime, he tried to get away but was caught red-handed. Dwayne Goodrich was a former football star for the Dallas Cowboys who was apparently a good guy that made a horrible mistake. One day, he was speeding down the freeway when he approached 2 motorists that were attempting to save a man in a burning car. Goodrich accidentally drove into the scene at 100 miles per hour. Even worse, after the crash, he tried to flee the scene. 2 men at the scene were killed and the third was badly injured. Goodrich was eventually taken into custody and found guilty of criminally negligent homicide. He was forced to spend 8 years in prison. When you commit a crime, you are forced to pay the punishment, whether it was due to negligence or if it was fully intentional. Goodrich learned that the hard way. However, when you are convicted of 19 crimes, negligence is no longer an excuse. Keith Wright was arrested for multiple home invasions and a sexual assault. In total, he has been convicted on 19 charges. These charges include forcible oral copulation, armed robbery, kidnapping, first-degree burglary, and false imprisonment. Wright was arrested after robbing and sexually assaulting a victim during a home invasion. Apparently, Wright entered the home through an unlocked door, robbed the victim at gunpoint, and assaulted her sexually. Detectives were able to link that crime to 2 other home invasion robberies that occurred previously. Every time, Wright threatened the homeowners at gunpoint and demanded that they give him their money. 19 charges! Wright was on a demented spree. Good thing he was put in jail. Last on our list is a player who got out of jail and won the Super Bowl the following season. The great Ray Lewis was accused of double murder back in the year 2000. A lot of evidence pointed to the possibility he was guilty. First, his alibi was proven false. He claimed he wasn't even present at the time of the crime, but witnesses clearly proved otherwise. Also, he was connected to the murder weapon, and the suit he was wearing during the night of his crime was nowhere to be found. Lewis was let off the hook for murder by testifying against 2 of his friends and pleading guilty to lying to investigators about his alibi. At the end of the trial, Lewis was forced to spend 2 weeks in prison. These guys are nuts. No wonder the NFL is so entertaining. The league is filled with psychos. Thanks for watching, and check out the other videos on your screen to view more NFL-related content.